Our webinar today is Forest Sustainability from a Forester's Point of View. It's a panel discussion with four people with a good forestry background: Rob O'Halloran, Richard Donovan, Charlie Moreno, and Kevin Evans. And we'll be introducing them shortly. Let me just tell you quickly, Frolling Energy is a mechanical contractor. We're focused on the installation of high efficiency, low emission commercial biomass boiler systems. We work a lot in schools. We've done many conversions of big oil boiler systems into either dry wood chips or wood pellets. Commercial buildings, our biggest account is an industrial building at Wheelan Engineering. The whole campus is offsetting over 200,000 gallons of oil a year. This is the kind of work that we do. We're a self-performing contractor. We handle all aspects of boiler system installation, as you can see. Whether it comes to having to build a boiler house, to erect the silos, to run pipes underground into a building, or to renovate a boiler room completely, that's our capability, and this is what we bring to the table. Oftentimes we work as a subcontractor to a GC that's doing a major renovation to a school, but sometimes it's just all about the boiler system, and we'll just handle that from soup to nuts. When someone is thinking about biomass boilers, we are very happy to talk with them, to develop the project, to talk about whether it's feasible, to look at a site. Very often, it seems like 99% of the time it's an existing building we're renovating, and we want to talk about what's going to be required to handle this changeover to a biomass system, to select the right system, the right size, to work on specifications and so forth. And talk about estimating and return on investment as well is a big part of what we do. People are always trying to cost justify even what seems to be a good move to something like this, but it still needs to have some sort of dollar value that's going to be a benefit. And part of that dollar value is our precision dry wood chips that we brought to America. It's a concept where you're taking mass quantities of green wood chips, bowl wood chips, good quality. We dry them down to 25% moisture after we've screened them down to about the size of a matchbook. And these now can be delivered by a blower truck, just like wood pellets can, but they're about 35% less costly than the wood pellets, which means and the price right now is actually very good. And that means that in Vermont, it's about $1.28 a gallon for oil. And in New Hampshire, because of the presence of thermal wrecks, it's close to 86 cents a gallon for oil on a today basis right now. And what's neat about biomass is the price is very steady. It might increase a little bit with inflation here and there, but it actually doesn't do anything about tracking with oil. And we all know the wild ride we've been on with oil and propane and so forth. But that's been a big difference. And we've got some 20 customers out there, and it's growing every year. So today, our webinar, Forest Sustainability from a Forester's Point of View. And first, I'm going to introduce one of our speakers, Charlie Moreno, who's a licensed professional forester. He's the principal of Merino Forestry in Stratford, New Hampshire. He's been practicing his trade for some 40 years. He has a BS in forestry from UNH, and his practice is mainly in the southeastern part of New Hampshire and Maine. Charlie oversees the management of some 40,000 acres of forest land, and that serves about 600 individual private landowners, plus town forests, conservation land for land trusts, schools, and other organizations. So Charlie, tell us about yourself here.
Okay, well, thank you, Jim. I guess you more or less did the introduction. I have been, just want to mention the Forest Stewards Guild. I'm a founding member of the Guild and served on their board of directors. I've also chaired the Granite State Division of the Society of American Foresters, and I've been very involved with forestry committees and organizations over the years. So anyways, I'm going to kind of launch into some thoughts, and I guess I'll start off with a personal statement. I've loved nature since an early age. I pursued the field of forestry to have a lifetime attachment to the woods. In my forestry career, I've been lucky to work for myself, and I followed my heart in silvicultural approaches that work closely with nature and in the forest's best interest whenever possible. Like everyone, I've encountered criticism about the harvest of forests, and while I also feel the outrage about abusive practices, These criticisms sometimes paint a broad brushstroke encompassing all of forestry, and this can be misleading. They really miss the nuances, and there's just so much more to the picture. And unfortunately, I don't have enough time to really talk a lot about it, but I'm going to just say a few things briefly. Throughout the U.S., I've encountered thoughtful foresters, field foresters, and like others I've met in Europe and travels there, they approach the management of forests with a long view, with science, with a deep knowledge of their local forest, and very importantly, with humility. People may question, why manage forests? Why cut them at all? Well, management revolves around wood. Wood is a magical resource that we all take for granted, but it is essential to our daily lives. I would argue that life without wood, if it can be imagined, would be stark and filled with non-renewable substitute materials like plastic and metal, and it'd probably be near impossible. Forest harvesting exists because there is a vast worldwide demand for wood products. But rather than just recklessly harvesting, forest management involves a sustainable and sometimes gentle and restorative approach with the forest when producing wood products. Our continent and this region once had a natural primary forest, rich in plants and wildlife, with myriad ecological interconnections that developed over millennia. Over the last 500 years, this ecological web has been badly damaged. Entire species and natural communities are rare or missing in our forests. Natural disturbance regimes have been altered. The dispersal of our global biota has introduced devastating plants, insects, and pathogens. And climate change is inexorably altering our forest ecology. The reality is that we will not recover, either naturally or through management, the conditions that existed in 1491. However, restoration silviculture can lead to complex structure, biodiversity, and improved resilience, while recapturing many vestiges of the original forest, the vanished forest that to me is the Holy Grail. On a landscape level, some of us consider forest management as a holistic term, a term that includes substantial reserve areas that will not be harvested, yet are essential to the whole. The foundation of forest management thus includes three parts, a triad. Forests that are left intact as reserves, such as old growth, unique and ecologically fragile areas, and areas that are simply left to evolve on their own. On the other end of the spectrum, there are forests that are managed primarily for intensive wood production, and this is kind of the worldwide picture. An example of this are the loblolly plantation forests that cover, I think, nearly 50 million acres in 14 states between Delaware and Texas. In the middle of this triad are the forests that are managed more naturally. And I think many of us are involved with this kind of management. There are many characteristics to this approach, but a key trait is natural regeneration. As a forester, I work with the natural self-planting and reestablishment of the forest for the future. And I am honored to say that this is one of the unique skill sets that defines me as a forester. So perhaps we should reframe criticism about forest management and direct it at short-sighted, destructive practices. These are not really forestry at all, because the essence of forestry is the forest, and it can involve a sustainable and sometimes gentle approach, and its long-term existence and sustainability. So that's the essence of the forest. I'm going to have Jim pan through a couple of slides here, and these are just very quickly some. You saw the restoration slide that I had up, and you saw that really cool black birch, an old tree. I believe it might even be the state champion black birch, but it's on the property of one of the landowners that I work with. And this is we're obviously working around trees like this and hoping to bring some of this complexity to our forest and structure and so much more. we need old trees, middle-aged trees, and young ones as replacements for the future. So next, Jim. Next slide, please. We work with forest management. This is a situation of managing early successional habitat on Southeast Land Trust property, beautiful lands that were conserved. I had managed the lands for the property owners before that, and you can see all in the distance nice areas of older forest, and then this young growth that supports a lot of habitat and a great beaver swamp system there. Next, Jim. This is Hanson Pines in Rochester, New Hampshire, city forest. There's a set of white pines here that are 160 years old, a good number of them, and most of the forest is well over a century old. But this is a heavily used forest, but we use management on this to maintain this forest, and we're not there to remove all the old trees or anything like that. It's just for the health of the forest and to make sure that there's replacement trees coming to replace these old ones someday. Go ahead, Jim. I like to think of that forest as having started when Abe Lincoln was inaugurated. This is a recent harvest on a private woodlands. It was infested with hemlock woolly adelgid, so we were losing all the hemlock. But on top of that, because it was a dark forest, there was only hemlock and beech as an understory species, nothing else for regeneration. So the biodiversity of this forest was really low, and both with issues either with insects or disease. So this opened it up a little bit to allow more light and a diversity of regeneration. Next, Jim, please. Red pine, we've been working with the salvage of this. Is another tree that we're losing very quickly to an exotic insect as well. And next, Jim. And this is also just last month, the thinning in the Durham Town Forest, also a heavily traveled community forest, and you see some red pine logs. This is in the middle of the logging operation, almost completed, just has to be picked up. But we had to salvage hundreds and hundreds of red pine trees that were either dead or dying because it would have been a hazard for the trails and the users of this forest. So, and this forest I had thinned. This was the third harvest that I've conducted on the Durham Town Forest since 1990. Okay, next. I guess that's it.
That is good. Charlie, thanks for that introduction. And next, we're going to go to Rob O'Halloran. Robbo's been in his own business as a consulting forester since 1982. He's based in Chester, Vermont. He attended the University of Maine and has a BS in forestry. His practice manages over 45,000 acres of forest in Vermont and the surrounding states. He's an assistant professor of forestry at the Vermont Technical College, and he's helped to revise the Northern Hardwood Silviculture Guide for the U.S. Forest Service, which you can see a copy of right there. Robbo, tell us about yourself a little bit.
Well, sure. Thank you, Charlie. That was a really nice introduction. And so rather than talk about how I got started in forestry, which is the same sort of thing, I'm going to charge into a little bit of our forest history and how we end up with the forest that we have today, using Vermont numbers as an example. There's a little variation from northern Maine to the seacoast to Massachusetts, but Vermont is a little bit unique in that it was developed much later. So in 1761, Vermont was like 99.9% wild forest. And what's fun about this forest history is there's three important dates to remember: 1761, 1861, and 1961. So if there's a quiz later on, that'll be easier. So we start with original forest. Vermont was the no man's land between British settlement to the south, French settlement to the north. And when the French and Indian War was over, Vermont was opened up for settlement and settled rapidly after that. but it really got going in the early 1800s with the introduction of merino sheep and the clearing of the hillsides for sheep pasture. Then eventually the transition to dairy farming once you had trains and could move the products around. So by 1861, Vermont was something like 20 or 25% forest, 75 or 80% cleared for agriculture and villages. So not just clear cut in a forestry sense, but converted to pasture use. So somewhere around the time of the Civil War, the forest sheep pastures were being abandoned, growing up to trees, and we have this post-pasture forest that's accumulated from the late 1800s to the middle 1900s. And then 1961 is the next important date with the last really big blow to agriculture in terms of acres, when every little farm that had a dozen cows was put out of business by the requirement for bulk tanks to refrigerate the raw milk. So that added 500,000 acres, which is like 10% of the forested area between 1950 and 1970, as those small farms just declined. So that gives us a forest today that tends to range from 60 to about 140 years old. And in the meantime, as this forest has regrown, the forestry community has prided itself in harvesting less than the growth rate. And you look back at forestry reports from 10 and 20 and 50 years ago, and we're harvesting 45% of our growth rate, and every state gets to say that. Right now we are at about 45%. But the bad news is, by harvesting less than the growth rate for 100 years, our forests have become way overcrowded and unhealthy because of it. So right now, our total growth in Vermont, this is Vermont numbers, we grow about 3.5 million cords of wood, and we harvest about 1 million cords, and about 1.5 million, 1.4 million cords of wood dies and rots in the forest every year in Vermont. Now, Maine's not quite so bad. Massachusetts is worse, and New Hampshire is fairly similar. But so our net growth is just over 1 million cords of wood, but we're rotting all these trees. So to talk about carbon accounting, which is an important topic these days, if we can agree that the atmosphere doesn't care if the carbon emissions come from coal or wood or oil or propane, then we also have to consider that our forests are contributing the carbon from 1.5 million cords. That's Vermont alone. I think if you add up all the acreage for what we've been talking about for the adjacent states, that's going to be about 8 times that. So we're talking 10 million cords of wood rotting in our region every year.
All right, Robbo, thank you very much. Good introduction there of that aspect of things. Now, Kevin Evans is our next speaker, and he is the Director of Woodlands for 40,000 acres of timberlands owned by Dartmouth College. 27,000 of those acres have been owned by Dartmouth since 1807. But he's been involved with them for just 28 years, so just a tiny little piece of the total ownership, but he's got records that go back a good distance. And he'll tell us more about that. His responsibilities include management of those 40,000 acres of forest and educating college students and others about his work. Kevin has a BS in forest management from UNH, and he's licensed as a professional forester in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. He's received numerous awards for that recognize his outstanding forestry work and application of scientific forestry principles. So, Kevin, give us your introduction.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Robo and Charlie. That's a great introduction. I think we're going to step it down a little bit, maybe take a look, go from the state to one ownership. So we're going to talk a little bit about the second college grant. As Jim said, it's 27,000 acres. We go to the next slide, Jim. It's just a location map for people that don't know where the second college grant is located. We're in northern New Hampshire, up in Coos County. 27,000 acres, about 10% of our ownership is in some kind of natural area, so about 2,700 acres. That leaves us with about 22,000 acres of operable forest. And over the last 75 years, we have averaged a timber harvest of about 7,500 cords of wood each year. We can flip to the next. A little bit about our management over time. We had our first timber sale on the property, sold some white pine in 1828. Most of our harvest from 1807 to 1930 was softwood. If we all know about softwood floats, and you can get it from the woods to the mill via water. So we did a lot of, I would say, timber barren cutting in those years. We would cut all the softwood on the property, float it down the river in 10 or 20 years, and then we would stop and let it grow again. And we did that up until a budworm epidemic in 1920, and we pretty much cut all the softwood off between 1920 and 1930. In 1940, trucks started coming into the woods, and we could start to cut some of our hardwood. And so we had large-scale hardwood saw log removal from probably 1947 to about 1967. And then in the late 1970s, we had another budworm attack, and college kind of started to, I think a little bit about their approach to forest management. We thought about going to more of a multiple use ecological ecosystem-based forest management system, looking a lot more at long-term sustainability than we had with this kind of cut and run stuff that we had been doing. To the next slide. One of our approaches, I think, has been that we do the right silviculture, as Charlie and Robo were talking about, on the right acre at the right time. So these are just some pictures of some of our operations over time. I think sometimes people have a tendency to show that, job right when the skidder's there, 10 minutes after it left. We see that, but we see things like this, picture over here in the corner when, it's been there for 3 or 4 years and it's grown back up. We can switch to the next slide. I think one of the other things we've started to think about since 1980 is that the forest is more than just, trees. It's habitat, wildlife habitat. We need to think about species of concern. We need to think about water quality. One of our biggest things is this bear nest over there on the right. It's the only carbohydrate we have in northern New Hampshire, and we need to manage those bear nests there for stuff. We flip to the next slide. One of the things I thought we'd just talk about, we've had many different timber inventories over time. We'll talk a little bit about that later on, but I thought one of the things we want to talk a little bit about is forest carbon. So in 1998, we did an inventory. We had about 1.6 million tons of carbon on the property. In 2018, our inventory showed that we had grown that to 1.7 million tons of carbon. And through that time, we harvested about 147,000 cords of wood. And I just put up this picture of a bunkhouse that we built at our Mount Moosilauke property. And all the wood for that building came from college property. And of that 147,000 cords of wood, what people need to also think about is that about 30 to 35% of it is in long-term carbon storage in either furniture or a bunkhouse or something like that. We can flip to the next slide. One of the other things that, we're really interested in having our ownership and doing it for a long time is our contributions to the local economy. And if you look at the NEFA study, for every 1,000 acres of forest land, it supports about 1.7 jobs. So on our 22,000 acres of forest, we provide about 37 jobs. That's in harvesting, trucking, pulp, paper, sawmills, and wood energy. We provide about $800,000 to the local economy and provide about 10 to 12 full-time jobs on this property. And the cool thing about is Dartmouth is that all the proceeds from this property go for scholarships for New Hampshire students to attend the college. And one of the things we've been doing for about the last 10 years is this is a picture of the president's conference room. We have provided all kinds of furniture and other products for the college. Every kid who comes into their dorm room, they have a bed, a dresser, and a desk, all made from wood from the college grant. And we use that in their freshman teaching to teach them about harvesting and their link to the land. And the next slide, I think, is the last one. And as Charlie said, we all got in forestry because we love trees. And this is a 48-inch yellow birch tree on our adaptive silviculture for climate change site. So we like to grow them big too. And that's all I got.
Excellent. Okay. Our next speaker is Richard Zell Donovan. He's a forestry consultant and a forestry auditor. He's the director, he has 45 years experience working in over 50 countries, studying and advising on forest certification, community forestry, biomass energy, and watershed management. He's worked on temperate, tropical, and boreal forests, so his view of the topic is pretty broad. Richard is one of the founders of the Forest Stewardship Council, and he's the author of a new global third-party auditing standard for forest ecosystem restoration. He's also helping to develop a global responsible forest contractor logger network that's called FORCON. He lives in Jericho, Vermont, and he has worked all over the U.S., in Mexico, and Paraguay, and Costa Rica. So he gets around. Richard.
Hey, thanks, Jim. So I'm going to make some comments. I'm not going to use any PowerPoints, and the comments are based on a personal perspective I wrote on biomass energy. Been involved in the topic for many years. You can get the perspective either from me or from Jim, and it's about 7-8 pages of there's a fair amount of personal stuff in there on kind of why I am where I am on this topic. And the key lenses, when I look at the issues around biomass energy, I look at it from what we're facing right now in terms of a climate challenge, because I do think it is a unique, real situation that we have to deal with. Always think about it from a biodiversity and sustainable forest management point of view. So the kind of stuff the other folks have been doing is really important. But I also have to plug in the community impacts, which are always important to me. So I don't just look at it. I do look at it from a climate point of view, but I also try to think about what it means in communities. I'm not an advocate, to be perfectly blunt, for statements around carbon neutrality for biomass energy, but I actually have problems with almost any energy technology from a carbon neutrality point of view. I tend to look at things from a cradle to grave perspective, and where ultimately, when these technologies get used, where do they end up as waste, even as far as that. So when I think about, am I an advocate for biomass energy? No, I'm an advocate for forests and communities. The second point I want to make, or a third point, sorry, is that one of the things I do in the perspective piece was I've been trying to gather kind of practical actions on the ground, boots on the ground perspectives on, if we're going to make forest and forestry climate resilient, and contribute in a positive way to climate dynamics, what do we got to do? And it means some things I actually think are pretty straightforward. I think we know a lot about them. We still don't know a lot of how these things are going to play out over the next 10 to 30 years, which is a critical period in terms of climate change. But for example, I think that when biomass harvesting goes into old growth, and particularly primary forests, if that becomes a significant percentage of any kind of biomass energy, I think, frankly speaking, the sector is going to lose its social license to operate. I think that's going to be a problem. And this is a big issue in northern British Columbia, or various parts of British Columbia. It's been raised as an issue in the southeastern United States, etc. So I think one of the things we always have to think about are the different places where all this stuff is coming from. And the guys who are with me on this have really given a good perspective on what's going on here in the Northeast. But one of the things we have to recognize is that this is a bigger, broader thing that's going on all over the place. I think we need to give more emphasis in a lot of these ecosystems to either the conservation of late successional old growth, or in fact even the restoration of old growth late successional forests. That may take us towards, at this point this particular point in time, do we want to extend some rotation lengths and cutting cycles? Is there a particular, because we have a time problem. I realize the dynamics around forests and they're different in every location, but we have a particular challenge right now in the next 30 years. And I think we need to have this, these are going to be tough discussions. There's still practices that, from my point of view, are patently just kind of silly. That's probably not fair. But for example, I was in Western Canada and I saw, the large scale slash and burning, of slash piles, which I understand the fire danger. I understand some of the other implications, but to me, those are practices that they just can't contribute positively in terms of greenhouse gases. And I think there's a real problem. And I think we need to do a lot of restoration. There's a lot of opportunities. I was talking to someone today and they said, according to one of the more recent studies, there's about 350 million hectares. That's about 700 million acres of degraded land around the world, degraded forest land, that could be subjected to restoration. My fourth point is, I think when we can, we should design what we're doing with biomass energy to contribute to good forestry, to sustainable forest management. And I think we know a lot. FSC has been around for now over 30 years. So I think we know a lot about what we should or could do in terms of good forest management practices, but I think we just got to do it on one level. And I also love the idea, whenever we can, of using these biomass energy facilities as kind of centers for local energy use and using what quote unquote waste heat and making them kind of almost manufacturing centers or centers for innovation. I think the more we do that, the better. The less we do that, the more we'll be subjected to criticism of not building these to be more climate resilient. The last point I'm going to make is that I think that there is a concern here. More of the world, for the first time in human history, more of the world is urban than it is rural, and there's a lot of lack of understanding of how forests work, where things come from. I'm an old white guy. I've been really fortunate. I was fundamentally influenced early in my career by a woman named Molly Beatty, who some of you may have even been able to meet, and certainly I knew well. She was one of my advisors in my master program. I'd love to see, Jim, in the future, maybe some of these forums we're a bunch of old white guys. It'd be nice to see some gender in there, people like Jane Diffley, who just retired from Society of Protection of New Hampshire Forests. I'm sure you guys know her. Get people like that involved so that we can kind of see where we take this in the future and recognize the importance that forests have for rural communities. But at the same time, I honestly think we really have to attack the challenge of climate. And we're in the middle of it. So it's going to be in our hands partially to kind of see how we can better do what we're doing now. I'll stop there, Jim, and let you head into the Q&A and other parts of the session. Thank you.
Richard, I just want one more thing. Is it just this world of opportunity chart that I had?
Yeah.
I didn't want to bring this up while you were talking, but just tell us about this. What's going on here?
So what's happened is you have a variety of organizations: World Resources Institute, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and others who have gone out and examined using remote sensing and forest cover mapping, and identified the places where, on one level, you have deforestation going on. You can see those red marks in the southern part of the Amazon, where there's rampant deforestation. It's gotten worse under Bolsonaro. And then you have other places where there's a tremendous opportunity for wide scale restoration. One of the conversations is that in some of these locations, it's not just about restoring forests. There actually may be grasslands or savanna forests that could be reestablished. The other point I would make is that in the restoration dynamic, and this is something I've been talking to people in the States about, is that in the longleaf pine ecosystem in southeastern U.S., in the forests in New Mexico and in California, they are using wood energy markets to create a market for that understory removal or that competition of hardwoods or the other species. And if they didn't have that market, they wouldn't be able to pay for some of the interventions they have to do to restore a natural forest. In the old days, maybe 100, 200 years ago, it would have been fires, but sometimes that's just not so easy to do as it was before. Or it just, does naturally happen in some cases. So I think what this is pointing to is that, and by the way, in June, there'll be a celebration, and this is the UN Decade for Restoration. And so this map is kind of informing that. We could go, honestly, I could go off the deep end on restoration. You don't want me to do that.
Okay.
But I think the point here is that when we look at biomass energy, each location has different implications from a silviculture point of view, a stewardship point of view, rural communities, etc. And it's, for me, it's become increasingly hard to generalize about the situations, but I love exploring it. I love discussing it, and I'm not afraid of the critics. I embrace the criticisms, to be perfectly honest. Sometimes they're off, sometimes they're on, but that's okay. Can't stand the heat, get out of the frying pan.
Okay. Well, an interesting group of guys here. And we're going to go to some questions now, and we're going to do a round robin on this and, rather brief answers. Again, I encourage you to ask your own questions in the chat function, and we'll be watching that and jumping on that, especially at the end. So first question for Robbo: what defines a healthy forest?
So I was thinking about trying to put together some slides for this, but I think that most of our audience are people that are familiar with trees enough that I can charge into this. But I would contend that the crowding in the forest is the largest impact on tree health in all of our temperate forests. And the tree rings are a record of that. The tree rings show really a record of crowding. For the people who want to look at tree rings for temperature or rainfall or other weather or climate related events, you need to go to the extreme forests to find that. Most of our forests clearly show a record of crowding in the tree rings. So then can you say that the forest is healthy if most of the trees are dying? And I've heard people say this, yeah, the trees are all dying from bark beetles or whatever, and there's going to be a forest fire, but isn't it groovy how nature has this wonderful ability to recover from all these natural disasters? But I just can't go there. So I think that, everybody else is going to talk about forest diversity and age class balance and all that stuff, but I just wanted to say that I don't think that a forest is healthy if the trees are dying.
Okay, Charlie.
There's a lot to this question, but I guess a few things. Natural native biota is a part of this. In other words, in free of exotic invasive plants is really crucial to this, because that completely changes the ecology of the forest. It for one thing, doesn't allow a badly invaded forest is not able to self-plant anymore because the natural regen can't get up through the thick invasives underneath. It also changes wildlife habitat. It changes the insect populations in the forest. Just a vast change. But anyways, that's one of the things. Also, a forest that has the non-native diseases and insects in check, and or not, or free of them. So we're in trouble. We really have an influx of all this, and climate change, the just the changes in our natural disturbance regimes. You no longer really have fire on the landscape. We probably have ice storms, much stronger ones than we ever did, more frequent big windstorms, hurricanes, whatever, that's coming down the pike. So managing for a forest that is resilient, that's diverse, is really the most important thing. Diverse in age classes, diverse in species. Most important thing, I think.
Evan.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with Charlie. I think, diversification of age classes, our big thing is a mosaic of different, habitat types and stuff over the ownership. You got to have, regenerating forest with older forest, with mid-stage forest to keep that sustainability going for a long period of time. And, I think one of the other things for me is looking at, and I think this comes from what Robo was saying, is, we need to look at growth versus removals, and, how we look at, accretion, ingrowth, and those kind of things over time.
Okay. Richard.
So when you ask the question, it's almost like, who are you asking the question and for what? Because an ecologist may answer it differently than a forester may answer it differently than a small landowner versus an industrial landowner. They all have different perspectives on it. And I'll just take one example of this as coarse woody debris. I'm old enough to remember when that was a relatively new term for a lot of people. And when we started first doing auditing and certification under FSC in Europe, we confronted the challenge of, what's all that damn junk out? We want a clean forest floor. We want to, it's messy. We don't want that mess. And frankly speaking, U.S. practices and Canadian practices influenced in a positive way what was going on over there. And so that you can today have conversations on what the index of coarse woody debris should be for a particular site, which I'll suggest to you that was not a common conversation 100 years ago. Coarse woody debris was seen as junk. Well, an ecologist doesn't think of it as junk. It plays a different role. So I really think, it's kind of like who you're talking to and what your objectives are. And that's going to have a lot of differences depending on who owns the forest and where it is. Thanks.
Okay. Question 2. What is good forest management? Kevin, I'm going to stick you with this one right off.
Yeah, well, I think, for me, good forest management is, as we said, the right silviculture on the right acre. But I maybe just talk a little bit about the college and, our start to look at, if you go back to 1947, when we started cutting our hardwood in our forest, we had about 70 million feet of saw logs and about 70,000 cords of hardwood pulp. We decided that we were going to liquidate all that, and by 1967 we had 3 million feet of saw logs and about 188,000 cords of hardwood pulp. This was the forestry of that time, pretty much to take the best and leave the rest. Didn't have a lot of hardwood markets for pulp, so you just left it behind. Then we did another inventory in 1986. We had grown that from 3 million feet to 16 million feet, but our hardwood pulp had gone to 330,000 cords of wood. So we were growing pulpwood almost exponentially. It needed to do something to, improve the forest. So wrote a management plan in 86. Like I said, it said we're going to do good forest management. We're going to do some improvement cuttings. We're going to go in there and remove that low grade, low value stuff and get it out. We did inventory in 1998. We had grown our saw logs back to 40 million feet, and we had reduced our pulp to about 240,000 boards. And we just did an inventory in 2018, and we've grown that saw log tally to about 50 million feet. And we've reduced our pulpwood again down to 223,000 boards. And I have to say that the factor of how we've been able to do this good forestry is we've been able to get rid of that low value, low grade material and get it to a market and sell it. So that's good forest management to us.
Richard.
I'll be short on this one. It's the balance of economic, social, and environmental values, and that's a very live thing. It's a site-specific prescription that balances those values, and there are going to be situations and parts of your forest, and I think this is something that both Charlie and Robbo talked about. Was there may be parts of your forest which, frankly speaking, should lean towards those ecological values above all, and frankly shouldn't probably be touched or should be left. That's where the values should be conserved. And there are other parts where you have the opportunity for maybe some economic activities. So I just think it's the devil's in the detail, but it's balancing those values. And I look forward to answering some of the questions we're already getting in the chart. It's going to be in the chat. It's going to be fun.
Okay. Bravo.
So, yeah, those are some very good introductions on it. There are no simple answers to this kind of question, and it takes understanding the problems before you can ever get to a solution. But the right silviculture on the right acre is, I suppose, the simplest answer if you could put it on a bumper sticker. But people talk about harvesting close to the growth rate of the forest, and that runs counter to doing the right silviculture on the right acre in the big picture, because, as I've said, we've harvested less than the growth rate for 100 years, and most of our forests, on the average, are overstocked by 10, 20, 30 tons per acre, depending on how you count it. We have this tremendous oversupply of wood, which contributes to our crowded conditions and mortality rate. So over in the big picture, if we could balance the age classes and then keep the stocking levels at a healthy level for those timber production acres, and I'll defer to Richard. I appreciate your comments that there are areas we want to leave alone or manage with a different perspective than timber management. And that brings back to the Charlie had mentioned this triage, where we have intensively managed forests like plantations, super trees. We have wild areas. And then really what we do in the Northeast is most of this sort of natural disturbance, replication, silviculture with native species and natural successional changes.
Okay. Charlie.
Okay, so thanks. Good recap, Robbo. I'm going to answer this in maybe a couple of temporal scales, if you will. One, the short view and the shorter time, and managing for the diversity of not only species and not just tree, but plant species and wildlife and everything that the forest ecology consists of. But also in managing, I've practiced for all the decades I've worked in the woods, just always a constant low grading, which is what Kevin Evans is talking about earlier. It's just removal of trees that nature would have thinned out probably anyways. And they're just the ones that aren't robust. They're struggling to free up the ones that are really doing well and are going to grow into quality timber, but also, they're beneficial for wildlife and they're healthy for the forest. So in the long view, this is hugely important for good forest management. It's taken, first of all, that red-tailed hawk's view from far above, looking down on the forest and saying, we need areas that are protected near wetlands or whatever. We need areas of young growth. We need areas of mid-age, et cetera. So that it's sort of bringing the whole mosaic into view as a red-tailed hawk might look at. But furthermore, it's long view time-wise, and I'm talking not 10 years, not 20 years, I'm talking 100 years, 200 years, and maybe even more, if we can imagine that. I think as foresters become more familiar with their local woods, they get a little closer and closer to very long distance views. And it's just imagining what that forest could be, what kind of an awesome forest you could have in the future. And I feel like a lot of my practice really is that I'm very concerned about the current forest, but I'm super concerned about what's coming in the future.
So next question, how does private land ownership impact forest management and health? And we'll start with Charlie on this one.
Well, as you can see from the numbers there, there is just huge numbers of acres, probably over 30 million acres in northern New England and New York State that are owned privately, and that means people like you and me, mom and pops, families. And how does that, for us, I find, I guess I can speak best in my local point of view. Most of the landowners I work with they're not like big investors. They're not concerned about the dividend yield of their forest. They're not thinking about that. They might have bought, a house and 50 acres came with it, or they might have inherited, 100 acres or, something like that. So in many cases, they may have owned it a long time and been very closely involved with it, and they know a lot about it. But in many cases, they don't know a lot about it. So I think a lot of this is the knowledge and the passion that people bring to, if they know about their woods. And that's a huge connection that foresters can make, is connect the landowner with the forest that they have and get them to know it intimately and understand it a little bit better. And once people know it, they love it, and that helps conserve it. Hey, Jim.
Rob, go ahead.
Okay, I'll charge right in. So similar to Charlie, my ownerships are mostly family ownerships. I have a few larger sort of semi-industrial scale owners and corporate ownerships, but family owners for the most part. And one of my most favorite things to do is to take people out and teach them about their forest. And it's fascinating to watch people learn to love their forest and to understand that the active management is how they're going to achieve their goals with that land. But I would say that the private ownership gives a tremendous diversity to our forests and our forest practices and even the goals for that forest. And we lose that with federal and state ownership, mostly with federal. And there's the constraint that they're always trying to keep everybody happy. And maybe the best way to do that is to do little or nothing. So you have federal ownership, and the Green Mountain National Forest harvests about 5% of the annual growth or less. And of course, that leads to out west, we see it in the forest fires on federal land. Here in the east, it doesn't burn, it just rots, but the carbon effect is the same.
Hey, Richard.
Yeah, so I'm influenced here by some information, and that is there's a guy named Butler. I can't remember his first name. Who's done a surveys of private landowners in the eastern United States, and when those landowners are surveyed, they basically put timber harvesting, down the line. It isn't the number one management objective for them. So I think it's really important to recognize that landowners really do have diverse opinions about what they want from their woods. It's not always the same thing, but by the same token, they have to pay taxes. They may have a kid going to college. They may have run into a health problem and they need money. So somehow that juxtaposition of financial pressures and managing the forest, that's real stuff. That's not imagined. Also, I would say that if somehow the economic side of it's important for them, in some cases, we're losing forest in almost all of our states here up in the Northeast, small percentages, but we're losing it a bit. And we're losing it in the areas where there's peri-urban development, exurban or whatever you want to call it. And it's getting converted to subdivisions. And unless we can make that value of the forest, keep it high enough, somehow do things, somebody's going to have to pay to keep forest as forest somehow, some way. Whether it's tax policy or it's incentives or it's whatever, somebody's going to have to keep that. And I think the last comment I'll make is that when I talked to biomass energy facilities sometimes, and in some of the regions, over 80% of their wood that they're using in their biomass energy facilities is coming from landowners under 250 acres. Now, what that says is that is a very important segment, and that's for small landowners. And so it means that they're economically important, but it also means they're just a really important, in terms of forests, they're really important players in the game. I'll stop there and pass it on to Kevin.
Well, I come from probably a little bit different area than Robo and Charlie. I am surrounded by large non-industrial private landowners who keep telling me they have a fiduciary responsibility to their stockholders. And we at the college, we feel that we have this somewhat a social license, and we have social obligations also to keep a good forest. So I mean, I would echo everybody's comments here, but I think for us there is difference when you go the scale of somebody owning 100, 200,000 acres. They have different responsibilities and things to do than a person with 40, maybe 50 acres or so.
Okay. Question 4. What trends do you see in annual forest growth versus annual harvest? And let's start with Kevin.
Yeah. I mean, I think that each region is different. And I think, when we start to look at New Hampshire, there are differences in northern New Hampshire than there are in southern New Hampshire. We've been an industrial, if you look at northern New Hampshire, the 1 million acres in Coos County, we've been supplying pulp and paper for 150 years. So, growth and cutting growth and maintaining some kind of a sustainable harvest and that kind of stuff has been important to us. South, and you start to see these age class distributions start to come up, grow out a little bit more. Those are those landowners that Richard were talking about, who timber is not their main thing. They are not in the timber business. Lots of people in northern New Hampshire are. And I think if you looked at northern New Hampshire, we're probably in Coos County right about even with removal and growth. It increases as you move south.
Okay, go ahead, Robo.
So the chart begins to point out that difference, as Kevin has mentioned, where Maine as a whole is harvesting about 2/3 of its annual growth. New Hampshire is right about half on the average, but then you go to northern New Hampshire with aggressive industrial management, and then southern New Hampshire with Charlie's clients and sort of low impact, smaller woodlots, a lot of unmanaged areas. Vermont is similar in that regard. I just want to throw in another number to that chart to keep it interesting. In Massachusetts, the ratio is 8-to-1. They're harvesting about 12% of their annual growth. And their mortality is through the roof and getting worse. And in Vermont, we've seen that mortality rate increase. It's about doubled in the 40 years that we have good numbers for. So a huge aspect of that is the age class imbalance, and we see that on the other chart there. So for anybody who's not aware of this situation, if you were going to grow trees to 100 years old on a sustainable basis on a large area, then you would want to be regenerating about 1% of the acreage each year. And then in theory, that by the time you work your way around the whole area, you have 100-year-old trees to harvest in a sustainable fashion. So that's 1%. If we were going to go with a 150-year cycle, then it'd be a little less than 1%, 2/3%. In Vermont, our harvest rate for regeneration harvesting is about 1/7 of 1%. And it depends on what numbers you use. But if you use 1/5, it means that we're on a 500-year cycle for the way that we manage our forests. Now, we really aren't, because what it means is that some areas are being intensively managed and some areas are being left alone, ignored, high graded every 50 years and then ignored. And so I just think that's a bad way to do it.
Hey, Charlie, do you want to go next and then I'll wrap this up, this question? Is that okay?
Sure, that's fine. Sure. Yeah, I'll just pick up from where Robbo left off there. And I got to say, annual harvesting is really tied to the market demand for wood products. You know, if we intended to have more annual harvests, it's not going to happen unless there's actually markets for this and a demand. And some of that demand is frankly comes from Canada, a good amount of it, and from overseas. And if we wanted to harvest less, again, if there's a demand, there's going to be cutting that happens. So we're tied into now a global economy as far as this goes. But I think probably one way or another, obviously I am in the camp that forest management is very important to maintain the health and to restore our forests to a more natural condition. I am very much in that camp. But anyways, the question is the management that's being practiced, or is the harvesting that's practicing out there, is it actually leading to healthier forests, more of an increase in the relative value of these forests? Or is all that just diagnostic of a lot of high grading and a diminishing of the forests? So it's important to keep managing on a sustainable level, and we want to be sure that we're doing it in the right way.
So I'm gonna wrap this question up with just a couple observations to kind of take what's going on here in the Northeast and blow it out. And what by that I mean, we are out, and this sounds a little parochial, but we are damn lucky in the Northeast. We have diverse markets. We have, a good logger, you go on the job, they'll have, I was just on about a 2,000 acre job the other day. I'm not the forest manager. Somebody else is doing that, guy named Joe Nelson. And there's that he's got like anywhere between 4 and 6 sorts going on for different markets.
Yeah, 8 and 10 is normal.
Well, yeah. There you go. There you go. So we are lucky. Now, you take this to where the biomass chips are coming from and the pellets, may not be as many log sorts going on. And there may not be the diversity of markets, or there may be. It's just different. And the big woodsheds where pellets are coming from for this large scale growth of biomass around the world, Southeast USA, British Columbia, the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Northern Europe, and believe it or not, now Vietnam. And so you want to talk about different realities. Those are different realities. And then you throw in all of this, not just what's happening in terms of forest growth and harvest, but what's going on with greenhouse gas emissions. And how does all of this affect what's going on in that global challenge that we're facing? Maybe we'll come back to that in the Q&A a little bit, because that's where it throws some, I'll call them left hooks or other things at you that we weren't expecting to have to deal with as directly. So I'll let you take us to the next stage, Jim.
Okay, let's do it. Let's go to, do we have a problem with low-grade wood and weed trees? Okay, Robbo.
Oh, I get to start on this one?
Yes, you do.
Okay. So, yeah, we have a problem. According to different kinds of inventories, but also my own personal inventories of all these woodlots that we manage, something like 50% of the wood in the forest is not suitable to make a sawlog product. And we've seen that as high as 80 and 90%. and over that in some forests. So yes, when you look at the forest from a tree health perspective with the overcrowding, that stocking level is something like 20 tons per acre overstocking with essentially low grade trees. These are the trees that would die anyway if we just leave them alone. Is it okay to just let these trees die in the forest? Well, it sort of is, but it means that the growth of the other trees is slowing down. If carbon is important, then we need to consider the carbon that's going into the atmosphere from that. And so here's another related topic. So as we harvest this wood, we have various markets, as Charlie's mentioned. We're sending wood for saw logs. We have some low-grade saw log markets to make railroad ties and things like that, where they're not too fussy about knots. But if you can't make lumber, well, now you have a roundwood product that can be used maybe for pulpwood, for commercial firewood, for homeowner firewood, or to be made into pellets or the bullwood chips that are used for these energy systems that are that's a word for our sponsor right there. But in any case, with all of these roundwood systems, there's always 20% or more of the tree that is basically a byproduct, and that's this biomass energy source. And if we don't use it, well, it lays in the woods and rots. And that's one aspect, and sometimes that's okay, and sometimes less okay. But the worst thing we can do is leave it in the woods to grow in the way of a better tree.
Kevin?
Yeah, I think maybe it's good maybe to switch that question up a little bit and say, do we have a problem with low grade markets? Because I think, if you look at northern New England, we're talking northern New Hampshire, Maine, and northern Vermont, we've lost 5 million tons of pulp capacity in the last 10 years. And on our ownership this winter, we weren't able to cut any softwood saw logs because there was no market for softwood pulp. And so, I think the problem that some of these low grade markets losing and going away then starts to make people do what we did in the 1940s, is cut saw logs and take them out and just leave the rest of the stuff behind, because we've got to pay those taxes and we've got to do that kind of stuff. So, I think that's in and where the problem is. So leave it at that.
Charlie?
I totally agree with Kevin. I feel like we went through a golden era of markets between 1990 and 2010. And before that, if you only have the high quality the high grade markets, just what Kevin said, you can only sell saw logs. Well, then that's what people seek to cut, and that's what they sell, and that's what gets cut, and everything else. The forests are degraded because all the low quality trees and the poorly grown trees are left behind. If you only have low grade markets, it reminds me of, as a forestry student, we did a field trip to Florida, of all places, to look at forest management there, and they were growing trees on a 25-year rotation to feed a bunch of pulp mills because they didn't have saw log markets in those days. So you really need a balance, and northern New England had this going full tilt for a good 30 years, and we could really practice good forestry because we were removing low grade to improve the growth of the better grown trees. And the landowners had something to aim for. They still do, because there's a lot of value in a veneer tree or a high quality pine tree or spruce tree. So I'll move it on.
Richard?
Yeah, I'll wrap it up with I very much agree with Kevin on that market question, because and this is where it gets complicated, because landowners do it. I brought it up before. They have financial, priorities and things that they have to do in order to pay taxes, particularly the private landowners. I would guess all landowners of all sizes, but particularly the small ones. And a typical harvest. I had the good fortune, maybe you did, Charlie, at some point to visit Menominee out in Wisconsin, and there, if I remember correctly, I think over 50% by volume of their harvest is #1 grade saw log or better. We're damn lucky if we can get to what, 20%?
Yeah,
That's right. That's right.
I don't, and so there's a lot. It's not like there's a lack of stuff there. I don't think the problem is having, on one level, it's not a problem of having too much low grade wood if you just take that in and of itself, because an ecologist would look at that and say, hey, look, there are a lot of benefits to that. I don't think the issue is weed trees. Again, that's an anthropogenic term, weed. What you think is a weed, I don't think is a weed, whatever. I do think we have an invasive species issue, and sometimes how we pay for getting rid of those invasives may have to be subsidized by something else, and there's not a lot of money to pay for that. At least as far as I can tell, these guys are on the ground with that particular issue in the Northeast more than I am in terms of what they're dealing with. So I think it's a little more complicated, and I would just say again that it all gets buggered up in a way, and we have to accept it when it comes into greenhouse gas dynamics, because we have a fundamental challenge there that we got to address somehow. And that's where it, can biomass energy be part of the solution, or is it always a problem? I happen to think it can be a little bit of, it can be a problem, and it can be part of the solution depending on how it's done. I'll leave it with that. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, number 6. What is the best way to expand forest carbon sequestration? Just this is the essence of the controversy, it seems, and a lot of people concerned about it. So let's start out. Richard, you're starting.
Well, there are a couple things I put in my paper on what I refer to as climate resilient forest practices. And I do think there's something to be said for maintaining late successional old growth and extending rotation lengths or cutting what do we call those, cutting cycles whenever we can. And right now, maybe that's a particular moment where government policy and maybe even company policy should foster and support people doing that, because that will keep more carbon in the ground in certain locations. And I do think we have to look at all the different GHG dynamics that are going on. And by the way, carbon's one of them. There's also methane and some other things. But let's just focus on carbon for a minute. What are the other ways in which, when we're doing forest operations, we can reduce CO2 emissions? And that has to do with the technology we're using in harvesting. That has to do with how we minimize skid trails and forest roads. There are a lot of different pieces of the puzzle. I'll stop there and let the other guys chip in. Thanks.
All right, Rob.
All right. So if we agree that some of our forests should be managed for the wide range of benefits, whether it's wood products or all the other things that we manage forests for, then we need to rely on people like us to be able to say, well, this works and this doesn't work, or better yet, that this policy or action is likely to achieve these objectives and likely not to achieve those objectives. So if carbon sequestration is the most important thing that we should do with our forests, then that leads to a certain set of management paradigms. However, I think that forests are much more important than just sequestering carbon. Let's see. I guess that's good enough for me. We're trying to keep this short.
All right, Charlie.
All right. Well, I want to kind of make a distinction here. We're talking carbon sequestration, but there's also carbon storage. And I think, if I understand this correctly, the carbon sequestration stage that is where the accumulation of carbon in the forest, carbon sink, if you will, happens most readily and rapidly in the early stages or young stages of a forest. A thickly, a dense forest that's growing fast is sequestering carbon at a faster rate than a middle-aged or older forest and so forth. And a middle-aged forest will, still growing fast, is also accumulating carbon. So that said, old forests that are well stocked, where they have live standing trees or stubs or fallen woody debris on the ground, those are the most effective for carbon storage. Okay, as long as there's a lot of biomass per acre. So it goes back, it harks back to what we've been talking about all this whole time, and that's multi-age forests, mixed-age forests, young growth, middle-age, mid-age growth, and old growth, on all scales, woodlots, regional, landscape. I'll hand it off to Kevin.
Yeah, I agree with Charlie. I think that's great. I think there's a lot to this that people are just starting to understand. There's an article in Nature that just came out that says that the carbon sequestration or carbon storage, that the article that people are using for the proforestation is overestimating carbon at somewhere around 30-35%. So I think we've still got a lot to learn here. Our particular forest, we've talked a lot about carbon storage, and when you have a well-stocked woodlot and you have good carbon stored there, the problem is additionality. And I think what people don't understand is, and there was another article that looked at some of these places where they were doing sequestration and carbon credits, and they're taking the wood in a place that says we're going to continue to do what we do normally, but it could be that this stand could be harvested to here, and then they're using a carbon storage for where they think they can all the way up through rather than additionality. So I think there's a real thing about that. Carbon's out there, and it's on that land. How we add and sequester more carbon. Sometimes, as Charlie says, that happens on understocked lands better than it happens on state lands that probably have high stocking and already have a lot of carbon storage there. There's not a lot for additionality. I think the other word we need to think about is leakage. Because if we stop harvesting wood in the Northeast, that wood's got to come from somewhere. And we need to, as Robo said, in Massachusetts is an importer of wood. At an opportunity when they could be harvesting wood and be maybe an exporter, I don't know. So this is a very complex issue, and I think there's a lot of things. And we could start to talk about albedo, and the fact that, forests are dark and they start to absorb radiation. And so if you want, hardwood forest is probably better than a softwood forest. So there's a lot about this issue that people need to learn and study, I think, as we move along.
Gotcha. Okay, good guys. Hey, those were the prepared questions. The Q&A thing is next here. I just wanted to say this one thing right here, which came up on the IPCC, the UN study in the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks while producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fiber, or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. It's like all of these things we've been talking about sort of wrapped in. One of the terms that people say is that we want to keep forests as forests, and you've got to just sort of maintain, you've got to do things to make that happen. I think that covers a lot of what we've talked about. There's a number of good questions here, and keep entering them in. I've printed these out, and one of them has to do with, this is from Derek to everybody. He says, how do foresters plan to carry out the right silviculture at the right time when they are boxed into using operators that have larger and larger machinery that has evolved based on the wood product markets? The ground conditions are no longer stable through the winter or summer, and no operator wants to stop once the harvest starts. So foresters are clearly stuck utilizing whatever John Deere is rolling out the door to carry out restoration that is delicate. So big machines, Robbo, tell me about that. What do you think?
Yeah, I want to jump in on that one. So I assume that Mark is not an active forester or forest landowner and is speaking kind of from an outside looking in perspective.
That's Derek,
Uh,
by the way. Okay, go
Oh,
ahead.
Derek, I'm sorry. Because I'm an active forest manager. A few weeks ago, I had 13 logging crews working. I had two large, one, I had one cut to length system. I had one whole tree harvesting with biomass shipping. Actually, I had two. I guess I had two whole tree harvesting with biomass and one whole tree harvesting without biomass. I also had 10 small scale skidder operators, usually one guy in a skidder, sometimes two guys with a skidder and a bulldozer, but your small scale crews. And yeah, they don't amount to as many acres, but I did have 10 of those guys working, covering a lot of ground. And so the right silviculture on the right acre, a big part of our job, like a Jewish matchmaker, is matching the right kind of equipment to the project.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll just jump in there, and the fact that we've gone to all, small operators. We cut almost all of our wood by hand and skid it with a skidder. And our thing has been, when we have times when the conditions aren't right, or we can't harvest wood, then we try to find something else for those operators to do, roadside brushing, filling potholes in, or something like that. So about 10 years ago, we went back to hand cutting because it seemed to operate much more on that ground with a smaller skidder and using the tops to fill in places that we needed to fill in.
Really
Okay.
interesting.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one too. Yeah, there's times when I wish a committee of us could design machinery and machinery suggestions and send them to John Deere and all the other Caterpillar and all the other ones, and really give them an idea of what we really need in the woods, not bigger and bigger and heavier. That said, I work with large crews. I work with small, one person, one skidder, all the whole gamut, kind of like Robbo. And we prepare the work, we mark every tree that gets cut, we lay out the projects, and we're really big on the timing of things. So that's the best I could say.
Yeah, Jim, the only other thing I'd add to that is that I may be wrong. Maybe there are some major technology gaps. I don't see that as the biggest challenge as using the right equipment in the right place. There's a lot more use of forwarders now than there ever obviously didn't even exist that much, 20, 30 years ago, that much. And depending on what forest you're in, there's a lot of forwarder use. And there's some advantages to them, disadvantages. All that equipment is expensive. As these guys know, loggers, it is not uncommon for them to have literally millions of dollars in equipment. And people don't recognize that. So that's why I think Kevin's comment was really a good one, because sometimes that equipment you can use for other things and amortize the cost by using it for different uses. And in other cases, you can't. So I think it's really using the right equipment. I don't see technology being the limiting factor right now. I think it's how we use them. And then, of course, paying the costs and the prices for using some of the newer, better equipment, which it's easy to say to someone, you better invest in something that's more energy efficient, but somebody's gonna have to pay for that, and that's not. Let's just say it ain't cheap.
As somebody comments that single operators with skidders are a dying breed. Everybody's gone to the more hefty equipment, but then when we had some of the biomass market dry up because of the closing of those power plants, the wood-fired power plants in New Hampshire, these guys had such a burden with their loans and so forth with this very expensive equipment they had bought. It's very difficult, I know. Another question here that has to do with this, and we're really, one of the key things is that heat and power are using low-grade wood. So does that work hand in hand with climate change and, sequestering and so forth, and health of the forest, all these things together? It sounds like we're going to have a lot of low-grade wood. So do you think an increase in demand in the low-grade timber market, such as biomass heating systems, could ultimately lead to healthier forests? They work hand in hand. Do they? Don't they? What's your thought? Seems
Sure, I'll
obvious.
jump in.
Yep.
So they absolutely fit together. And as I was saying, in the course of harvesting, the modern wood heating systems on even a fairly large scale are not able to use what we call the dirty chips with bark and leaves and stuff like that. You take a small amount of bark and a bullwood chip, but you're making a high quality chip for these modern systems. And you're probably burning your residues to dry those chips out, which is a beautiful thing. But there's always that 20% of the tree that's going to be left behind to rot. And in some cases, it makes sense for that to come out as part of a biomass energy, which can be burned on a larger scale on those electrical generation or larger combined heat and power situations. But the stemwood only harvesting loses a tremendous amount of silvicultural benefit from the standpoint that there are places that I operate in where you have diseased beech, like sapling growth of diseased beech that we're just trying to get rid of. And there's nothing to do with that other than cut it with a hot saw and throw it in a chipper.
That's right.
And get it burned someplace, basically. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Okay.
But there's always going to be plenty of roundwood for you guys to make bowl chips too.
Yeah, exactly. Any other comments on this one?
I would just say that over the last 75 years, we've been trying to get rid of every stick of low grade wood that we have, and it ain't never going to happen.
Yeah.
Other thing that people have to understand is that on the top of that saw log, there's still 40–50% of roundwood on the top of that in the rest of the tree. So even when you're cutting saw logs, you still got pulp in the top of those trees. So
Right. All right, just one question more to Robbo. It says rotting wood takes a long time to release carbon into the air, right? And some of that carbon also ends up in the soil. So why is a high proportion of dead wood in the forest a bad thing?
So that begs the question, why is carbon in the atmosphere a bad thing?
Say what?
What? So if carbon in the atmosphere is okay, then we can rot trees all day long. But if we want our forests to do the things that we want them to do, we want the trees to be healthy and growing. But I've kind of I don't mean to make light of the question, but the point is there's 1.4 million cords of trees dying every year. And yes, some of that stays on the forest soil and builds up the soil, but quite a lot of it is being released into the atmosphere. And I guess in my ideal world where we're managing these forests to produce all the benefits that we appreciate from a managed forest, that wood could be replacing fossil fuels where we get some benefit from that wood in a carbon perspective.
Anybody else?
I have a thought on this, a little bit of an offshoot, I guess, but there's talk out there. I'm pretty astonished about this, about how burning coal might be cleaner or better than burning wood, and for that matter, petrochemicals. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me because on one hand, the forest is all on the Earth's mantle. Okay, it's all part of the carbon cycle. Whether the tree rots and eventually releases a good amount of that back into the atmosphere, the carbon, or whether it's in the soil but that grows back into a tree. So it's cycled on the Earth's mantle. When you're removing coal or oil or natural gas. You're mining carbon that's been locked in the earth for millions and millions, hundreds of millions of years. And now you're adding that to the atmosphere. There's no going back on that. We're adding it in, we're not taking it back out. We can't. So there's a big difference there. Biomass is inherently cleaner from that standpoint.
We're actually looking at some things, some silviculture to mitigate climate change and those kind of things. And some of the things that we've actually been doing for these episodic rainstorms that we're getting, these 3 and 4 inch rainstorms, is we're actually practicing trying to leave 1 or 2 trees, pulpy trees, where we just drop them perpendicular to the slope so that it will slow that rain coming down across the surface, to just slow it down so it doesn't erode things as much. So, you know, there's plenty of dead and down out there, and we can, you know, provide some of it to maybe mitigate something else too. So we as foresters are thinking about all kinds of things, I think, as climate change and how to mitigate the effects of that climate.
One thing that we don't bring up here is, because we're forest oriented on this talk today, but there's the urban forest and all those dead trees that come out of the cities that have to have a destination. Where are they going to go? You know, they can't haul them very far because they're not getting paid much for them often. That's the low grade market, the bad low grade market. So, and you know, that was something that was powering these power plants. And what are you going to do with this stuff? Another question that somebody has is from Brad. He says, does the fact that most biomass is produced by whole tree harvesting techniques give you any pause? What are the long-term implications of this type of extraction on residual stands, soil, carbon, residual trees, wildlife, etc.? Are the benefits worth the ecological drawbacks in the northern New England forest? I think we've answered this in different ways, but anybody have a quick result on that one?
So I'll say that I'm a big fan of whole tree harvesting, because these guys have the, you know, $2 million worth of logging equipment, and they've got the payments and stuff to go with it. But the fact of the matter is, they have the lowest cost per ton to process this wood. So they can afford to cut a higher proportion of poor quality wood than anybody else. And when I'm marking, especially the larger projects, when you've got all this junk to get rid of, a guy with a skidder is going to go broke cutting 5 loads of pulp to every load of saw logs. I've had jobs where we've cut 30 loads of pulp and chips for every load of saw logs, and I'm proud of that.
Yeah.
As far as soils and that sort of thing, we don't do that much real clear cutting. We do quite a bit of low density shelter wood, and this sort of variable retention type of harvesting. But with the whole tree chipping, it's only a small portion that actually ends up in the chipper, and a lot of wood is left behind to rot, stuff that's too big for the chipper, your large coarse woody debris, all the stuff that breaks off. A study in Maine said that's about 9 to 10 tons per acre that's typically left behind in an actual clear cut. But if you're not clear cutting, then you have a canopy, even if it's a sparse canopy, 20%, 30%, that you're going to have leaves falling on the floor and cycling those soil nutrients. We are blessed with an abundant growth directly after harvest. Those nutrients are cycled in a hurry. So I would say that in the course of managing forests, this is one of the tools in the toolbox to accomplish our objectives.
Okay. Anybody else?
So let me, Jim, just as a little kind of a segue here, I want to pick up on part of what Kevin said, because I've been having communication the last couple of days with Bill Keaton and Tony D'Amato and Caitlin Littlefield, all at the University of Vermont. They all have different specialties, and they're not necessarily interchangeable. They each have a different lens and perspective on it. And one of the questions I've been asking is, well, what makes for, given this increase in storms, given what we're seeing in terms of climate change, what makes for the most resilient forest to stay up as forest? Is it a blend of species? Is it a blend of patches of age growth? etc. And it's an area where there's a ton of research going on right now. Some of that research goes back to the 1938 hurricane in Quabbin Reservoir, actually. So I think we got a lot to learn about what's going to make for the most resilient forest. There is some perspective that diverse forests are the better to resist these issues, or to be resilient for these issues. And I tend to believe that's probably a good thing, but I think there may be some counterintuitive stuff that depending on the forest site. The other thing I wanted to do was to kind of just react a little bit to comments that I think Mark Bowen and Jeannie made on the chat, which is around this longer term perspective on climate and what we got to do now in this kind of critical climate challenge period. And to Jeannie, I would say, let's make sure that when you look at where your chips are coming from, that they're coming from forestry that supports the best in forestry. I would suggest that it's not wrong for your school to ask that question, to make sure that it's coming from good places where good management is done. We know how to make sure that can be done, and it's okay for you to ask it. But to hit Mark's thing, I think that one of the interesting things here is that in virtually pretty much all the forests where the major wood baskets for wood pellets, wood fiber for energy is a byproduct. And when you look at what's actually coming from the forest, oftentimes it's building materials. Well, guess what? There's a lively discussion now on mass timber versus concrete versus steel. So it's kind of hard. Maybe I'm just overcomplicating it, but there's not easy answers here, and it's a juxtaposition of things and values and where you want to go. And you're going to have a hard time convincing me. There may be certain situations where coal emissions from a particulate point of view or some other perspective are less than biomass. You're going to have a hard time, because I'll be damned. I've been to coal mines, and I'll be darned if I want my kids and those people work really hard in those mines, but I'll be damned if I want my family working in that kind of situation. So I think we got to get off coal. I think fossil fuels, it's easy in some respects, because a lot of times it's a long way away from us. We can't see the impacts, and yet it's caused war. It's caused all sorts of things. So these are complicated questions. I don't think there's a simple silver bullet solution. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Jim.
Sure. Mark Bowen also made a comment at the beginning about having a wood lot and a wood stove. And might that be a particulate pollution problem that is worse actually than burning oil? And I'll say to Mark that the state of Vermont has a wood stove changeout program, because if you look at some of the stats that are out there about typical wood stoves, especially those 70s and 80s wood stoves that refuse to die, the particulate's pretty bad. And actually you put in a new pellet boiler from wherever, from Austria, typically, they're like 80% plus efficient. And the particulate is way down. You can heat a school with the building that has far better pollution characteristics, than even what it matches what these residential ones are. And you look at old green chip systems, and they're kind of ugly and whatever. They can be cleaned up, and there's different things you can do for them. So it's a matter of the technology. And I think if you look into it, you'll find not only are they very efficient at what they do, but they're very clean burning. So I'll answer that one. Besides the FSC certification, is there some other verification system that exists, which is most practical to implement? And that's hard. Massachusetts is starting to do some of that verification. What do you guys say? Is there any way other than just knowing your logger, your source?
I will say that, for example, Burlington Electric has their own core of team that's out there trying to do quality control on where their stuff comes from. So you don't necessarily have to get certified to be able to do that. It's just certification is there as a tool, or maybe you take the standards and you do your own checking, but you use those standards or something like that. But I know Kevin and I have interacted on this question. God, it was years ago. And Charlie and I'm sure Rob will have different perspectives on it. What I would not want it to see is it turn into a pro-con argument on certification, because that's a whole other ball of wax. But I think the question is, how do you make sure? And I don't think there's any substitute for active engagement to make sure you get what you want.
Yep. making sure that there's a forester involved in the cut that you're getting your chips from. You know, somebody like Frolling Energy or the New England Wood Pellet that's taking in a lot of different wood from all different sources, has that potential to ask for some sort of verification. And that's what the state of Massachusetts is doing, at least on their thermal AEC programs. Here's another that says, is it possible, this Dickin writes, he says, is it possible to evaluate the climate benefits through fossil fuel offsets of the current and future forest products as a part of the balance? That may be a little, anybody have an answer to that one? It's a tough one. Let's go on here. The New England Forestry Foundation, Amanda writes, is looking at this with exemplary forest program while keeping forest health wildlife front and center. If I'm not mistaken, NEFF has concluded that Maine should be doing slightly less aggressive harvesting, but all of the New England states, such as Richard noted, should and could be doing quite a bit more of it to hit maximum carbon sequestration storage. So interesting. Thoughts? Comments?
Well, that goes into, Charlie went into this quite a bit with the question about carbon sequestration, and you have to understand, are you maximizing the tons of carbon that you're storing per acre, or are you maximizing the rate at which you're storing carbon? And the middle ground is that balance of age classes where you have older forests storing a lot, you have younger forests growing fast, and you have reasonable stocking levels all the way through where you have that additionality in the areas that you're managing.
Okay, that's good. So Kelly Short has, speaking of greenhouse gas, results of a study specifically about impact of using wood pellet chips versus fossil fuels is at the nfcenter.org/benefits. So that's something you can read. The decline of the whole, let's see, I think I read that one. Here's one that's just from a worldview. Are there lessons to learn regarding citizen and government appreciation for forests from an international viewpoint? Frank writes that.
You know that.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say we have fall foliage time in Vermont.
Yeah, I think the international perspective is that this is really dynamic right now. The fur is flying in northern BC right now on this topic. The fur is flying in Europe on this topic, and there's diverse opinions. In some cases, it revolves around incentives, taxes, and others. And I would argue that if we are going to use incentives, let's use incentives so that people keep forests as forests. And at this particular moment, I would love to see there be incentives for conserving and expanding wherever we can late successional low growth. That's my own personal viewpoint. I don't expect everybody to jump on board with that one. But I think right now with the climate challenge, the extent to which we can maximize the positive dynamics on greenhouse gases, I think we need to. And that's where I'd like to see incentives put in place. But, you know, you get into public policy, that sure ain't I don't work in government, never have. So there you go. I'll stop there.
Government does make a big difference when it comes to incentives, and if they write them and drop them, or if they have them or don't have them, you'll see a lot of activity in the boiler business in particular, incentivizing the conversion. Obviously, there's a certain amount of controversy with the wood. And here's another question. It says, if, as Richard says, we have only 30 years to deal with carbon emissions, in the short term, even wood in the mantle, as Charlie points out, should not be burned for the next few decades. In other words, there's this urgency that we have about it. My quick comment on the urgency of wood or not wood is look at the proportion of carbon that comes from fossil fuels versus what would come from burning wood. And that's the problem. I mean, it's massive. It's a massive, massive difference between the two. And here we are, and we're not trying to heat Nashua, and we're not trying to heat Boston. We're trying to heat the rural areas where the wood comes from. We're going to keep them employed. We're going to keep the forest going. That's really a good thing. And it's, again, a little micro spec on the whole energy use in the US. Anybody else have a comment on that? Get my little piece.
Well, I'd just like to chime in on Richard has touched on the sort of more global perspective, and the conditions being different in different areas are going to have different problems and solutions. But you think of these western forests that are just so prone to fire, they're overstocked, that we've been putting the fires out for 100 years, and they're just waiting for a spark. There's an opportunity for a biomass product to be harvested and put to use instead of just burning and releasing the carbon and all that smoke to the atmosphere. And then you have different problems. Vietnam is producing wood for wood products. Indonesia, the harvesting there. You look at growing eucalyptus in South America and radiata pine. The wood is going to come from somewhere. And I think we do a pretty good job of managing these forests in the Northeast, and we can argue about the details, and I hope we do, because this is fun.
Good. Thinking about fires, with the climate change, are we going to be having fire problems similar to the West at some point? I mean, what's your thoughts on that, and how do we prepare for that?
Well, it's happened before,
It has.
It has. And I think back to, I wasn't around for it, but there are people that I work with that were. In 1947, there was quite a large burn that started up near Freiburg, Maine, and burned clear to the coast, right to Kennebunk, Maine, and it had offshoots into New Hampshire. And
Acadia.
Acadia is another one. So,
Yep.
And last summer, at least in southeastern New Hampshire, it was a drought like no one has ever seen. I think it was a little bit variable around New England, but these spot droughts and more regional droughts are happening, and we're not, as people used to call it, the asbestos forest, which is kind of a weird term, but we're not necessarily that as much as we think.
You're going to burn it one way, you might burn it another way unexpectedly, and imagine the carbon that goes up in a forest fire. My oh my.
And I did talk a little bit about before I was saying, well, the fire, natural disturbance regime of fire is not really in the picture anymore. Well, a massive forest fire, is not the same thing as what would have naturally have been occurring, paced with in time with the way the forest evolved. But we've had suppression since the 1920s, and it's a whole different picture now.
Okay.
The other, Jim, the other thing I'd contribute there is that the organization that Charlie and I are both involved in, or at least have been members on, I haven't been quite as active as Charlie has, is the Forest Stewards Guild. And the Guild is doing work both in the Southeast and also in the West Coast in certain situations, looking at issues in the West. It's looking at fire and forest management. And in the Southeast, it's looking at the use of wood. It's involved in figuring out how to appropriately place the biomass energy forestry stuff in the continuum of forest management in the Southeast. And so I think that's really important stuff that's going on, because we all know how catastrophic the fires have been on the West Coast, particularly in the last couple of years. And all indications, I'm not sure that means we need to hoover up the forest like some have implied, but I think there is some challenging stuff out there that needs to be dealt with.
Okay. Are forests that have never been cut necessarily even aged? In other words, getting older and older as a whole.
Well, by definition, we think of those forests as actually multiple aged, because never is a long time. So if you go back, say, to the glacial periods, that's kind of a never. The natural mortality in the forests over time is theoretically going to give you a multiple age forest. But the reality is most of our forests have started in the last 200 years by some type of major, what you call stand replacing event. Out west, it's fires. Here, it's clear cutting for forest products in the early and middle 1800s, clearing for farming, and then abandonment of the farms. So we generally start with an even age forest. And it might be, so you think of what we call the matrix forest is your sort of your main canopy. And we have forests, all you guys are familiar with this, where you have a main canopy that might be 140 years old, and the forest has been picked away at by previous owners, but you have other age classes, but they're not actually effective because they've been stunted and crowded so long, and you've lost the shade intolerant species, and maybe you're left with just beech and hemlock that make up those second age classes. So it brings the concept of age class balance and proper management, but basically as we leave these forests alone, if we don't create a new age class, something's going to accumulate in those gaps from natural mortality.
Okay.
I would just say that when I give a tour, I love to take people to a place that we have no records on our ownership that it's ever been harvested. And what you're going to see are 2 and 3 inch trees. And I always tell people, it depends on what time on the clock that you seem to visit that place, because we have pictures of that stand in 1970 where you can see down through 20-inch fir and spruce trees to the river. And then the budworm came, and the budworm killed it all. And now it's regenerating back. And it's, as I say, it was at 11 o'clock, now it's at 1 o'clock. So, there's lots of things that happen to the forest. And it doesn't have to be clear cut. It can be insect damage, or it can be something else that will regenerate some of those.
Kevin, do you also have some big tree growth, old unharvested areas as well?
We have a few. Most of those, I will say, are probably inoperable and could not have been harvested over the last 200 years. You saw a 48-inch yellow birch that's in a stand that's been harvested 3 times over the last 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right.
So,
Go ahead,
Richard?
no, go ahead, Charlie, and then I'll go.
Oh, okay. Well, no, just back to the question that was asked, if forests that have never been cut, are they always multiple aged? And yes, but not always. What happens is that you have just an accumulation of disturbances, small ones, medium ones, natural disturbances over centuries. And so with the opening of canopy gaps, small, medium, large, you have new growth. And so you end up with a big array of age classes through that natural forest. And eventually, somewhere along the line, sure enough, it's going to be something. Could be a wildfire, it could be a Category 4 hurricane, it could be an earthquake, it could be something. There's going to be a reset in a large, broad area, and everything goes down. Mount St. Helens, look what happened. Everything goes down. It's a reset. You start from scratch, and that original initial forest is mostly near even aged. Most of the trees are, as they come back, there might be a little bit of separation in age classes, but it's a reset.
So I was gonna say that actually I was gonna, in a way, lobbing a bomb is probably too strong words, but there's a good way and a bad way of doing things. And for the longest time, I'm not the classically trained foresters like these other 3 guys are. So, with all due respect, I actually think one of the things I'm working on with another group of people is on recognizing good loggers. There are good loggers and bad loggers. Guess what? They're good for it, and there are foresters who do a damn good job. And I think that the whole field has evolved a lot over the last 30 years. So we have a better sense of what good forestry is, balancing the different values. That when you had this conversation pre-1990 and for sure pre-1980, whoa, You know, they're, oh wait, you can't certify that. You can't. That's not how you're gonna. If you certify, you're gonna restrict everybody's ability to do things. And I don't think we've done that. You still can get 10 foresters on a block of forest and get 10 different prescriptions, and they may all be making sense. But there's different ways of doing it. And I just feel like one of the things we need to be doing is giving an equal balance, not just to the forester community, but also to the logger community, and give the recognition to the people that are doing it right. And that's something that I've been an advocate for a long time, probably maybe too much for some people's liking, but I'm not afraid to call it out when I also see bad practices. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
It's good. It's good. Anybody else? We need to tie this thing up. We're going on 2 hours. I think it's probably smart. We've got 23 people left, but that includes some of us. So tell me, anybody have a conclusion remark? I think what Richard did was very good just now. Anything else? Well, this is the last in a series of what Frolling Energy is doing in the webinars. Not the total last, but at this period, we've had about 5 or 6 in a row here and every week. And we may get back into that, say in June or so. We'll see what happens. All of these available on YouTube. You want to, this will be recorded. This has been recorded and it will be posted in the next few days. And look for that on YouTube. Just type in Frolling Energy Biomass Systems and you'll find it. If you need a professional education credit, let me know, jim@frollingenergy.com. So I want to thank our guests here today, Charlie and Robbo and Richard and Kevin. You've done a great job. I think it was good fun. It was good information. You did really well. I think the format allowed you guys to talk as you wish and to get the point across. There's a lot of information there. It's like people might want to watch this 2 or 3 times. So,
I don't know about that.
I don't know if they could stand that, but to zip
That was a
through it.
nice job of Master of Ceremonies, Jim.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks, Jim.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
pleasure to be here with the other panelists as well. Nice to be with you guys.
That's
See you in the
good.
woods sometime, I hope.
There you go.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Internationally, wherever, right, Richard? Thank
You
you
got
very
it.
much. Okay. Good, guys.
Sure.
Appreciate it. And we'll say goodbye to everybody. Thank you.
All
Thank you.
right. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Yep, bye-bye.
Good night.
Night.